Coalition politics may not be perfect, but they are likely the only way you can have your voice be heard. When democracy doesn't give you an option that represents you, when democracy doesn't give you the choice that you want, that is when democracy has failed you, and that is the alternative that Side Prop is pushing in this debate. Incredibly proud to oppose. One major clarification that I'd like to make at the top of my speech, I want to point out how coalitions actually function in the status quo, because I think that the characterization on the comparative that Prop 1 gave you was incredibly uncharitable. Coalitions are not large, all-encompassing political parties that will replace parties altogether. These are temporary agreements to get stuff done by multiple political parties. So when multiple parties form a coalition to win an election or get a bill passed, for example, that coalition only exists to win that election or pass that bill. It is also true that coalitions can last for multiple election cycles or become the status quo. But understand that even within coalitions, political parties still have their own independent interests and operate independently for the most part. Before moving on to substantive, there's a few responses that I want to give towards Prop. Their claim on coalition politics is principally abhorrent because political parties will no longer represent their constituents. Here's where I want to disprove the main premise of their case. They seem to think that when political parties join coalitions, they get sucked into another huge political party with completely different goals and values. This characterization is wrong for three reasons. One, political parties have pre-established hierarchies that you cannot just dissolve like Prop seems to think. But even if this was possible, these structures, even if it was possible to destroy these structures, politicians wouldn't have incentive to join these coalitions if they were just going to be demoted like that. But second, political parties have different values and goals. Sometimes goals align, but the values themselves differ. And therefore, the parties in a coalition have an incentive to stay independent because those values exist on the level of the individual voter, and that is never going to change on either side of the house. But third, even if it were the case that parties completely abandoned their constituents, they obviously wouldn't have those constituents anymore and therefore these parties would just be useless to the coalition as a whole. But secondly, on their point that this makes large political parties even larger and reduces checks and balances. Two responses. First, I want to point out that Side Prop is, again, confusing larger political parties with coalitions themselves. Because even in their setup, they tell you that coalition politics happens within countries that have a lot of different political parties, which have a lot of different voters who want different things. Your interests as a voter don't really change when your party decides to form a coalition. So I'm unsure as to why, because large parties form coalitions, they suddenly become larger, given that their constituents don't have any real change in interests or values. But the second thing is on the claim about checks and balances. This is literally not true, because in a coalition government, the different political parties within that coalition check each other. They make sure that no one political party has all the power. They make sure that no extremely radical policy that very few people want gets passed. Those are the checks and balances that exist on our side of the house. All right, moving on to substantive case then, and that completely takes out all the proposition case so far. First argument then, why is democracy far more representative under our side of the house? And here's the crucial thing, because I don't think it's as simple as Prop wants to portray. Political parties engage with democracy in two key ways. The first is the executive, i.e. things like presidential elections, and the second is the legislative, so trying to get seats in parliament, for example. Given that we are talking about a democracy that has a lot of different political parties, their side harms democracy in a few key ways. First of all, we think that democracy is a lot less representative on their side of the house, because presumably on their side of the house, lots of individual parties exist, and those individual parties all represent an incredibly small fraction of the population, like the political system in Indonesia, for example. That is to say that when you're talking about incredibly small political parties who have broadly different values, presidential candidates, from those political parties, are more likely to represent a much smaller part of the population on their side of the house, because the political parties on their side of the house are far more individualistic and have far less incentive to compromise. But the second thing is that legislative bodies become far less effective under their side of the house. Crucially, when you have lots of different political parties that are less willing to compromise on legislation, the process of actually passing laws and bills and other kinds of legislation is intuitively much slower, given that parties on their side of the house have an active incentive to not compromise on what they want at all. We think that at best, this means that legislation is far less effective and far slower on their side of the House, and at worst, it just results in a lot more bureaucracy that ruins the entire legislative branch. It means it is incredibly ineffective as a whole. But the third harm that I would point out is that smaller political parties are less likely to be represented under their side of the House, and this applies in both instances, right? Because it is often the case that in these kinds of democracies, the sheer amount of political parties means that some people get no representation at all, especially under their side. And we think that that is something that is principally abhorrent because it means that democracy is not representing your interests. Why is the comparative on our side far better then? Three things. First of all, on our side of the House, political candidates have to be accountable to far more individuals when they are pushed by a coalition. And this is far better because it means that more people have their voices heard within a democracy, because these candidates are presumably candidates that lots of different political parties are happy with. But second, intuitively, when you have set coalitions that have incentives to cooperate with each other for the purpose of things like elections, legislation is likely to be far more effective because these parties have an active incentive to be constructive and cooperative during the process of actually getting those bills and laws passed. But the third thing, crucially on our side of the House, we fulfill the representative aspect of democracy far better, because smaller political parties are more likely to be represented in government on our side of the House. Coalitions are formed based on having similar interests on particular issues, and having more political parties is considered an asset because it means you have more constituents to vote in your representatives. That means that smaller political parties, which happen to have similar interests with broad coalitions, are more likely to be represented by these coalitions and strategically voted in. And this is good because it means that democracy on our side is far more representative. Second argument then, why does coalition politics reduce political polarization? We think that on their side of the House, the political system is a lot worse for two reasons. One, political parties have an active incentive to cater to very specific needs of small groups of people, because that is the only way to maintain a stable voter base in an incredibly diverse, multi-party system like Indonesia, for example. But the second thing, this also means that political parties are unwilling to compromise on incredibly similar issues, because it is often the case that the constituents of these political parties want to try and gain leverage by being oppositional towards other parties. Know how on their side of the House, political parties are engaged in a direct power struggle because lots of them see being on the winning side of an issue as a way to sway voters away from parties that might align with their interests more, but are just simply less popular. The impact of this is that it makes democracy and politics a lot more polarizing on their side of the House, because constituents of different political parties, especially larger and more powerful parties, have an incentive to make big moves and be incredibly oppositional towards each other. That's what leads to more conflict on the ground between individual voters and more political instability. Our side is far better on the comparative because coalition politics incentivizes parties to try and seem inclusive as possible. It means that parties have a lot more incentive to try and find common ground for each other so that they can actually strategically allocate their voters and they can get as many political parties within that coalition as possible. Politics is a lot less polarized under our side for that reason. Coalition politics may not be perfect, but in these instances, they are the only form of democracy that works. For that reason, I'm incredibly proud to oppose.